In September 1779, a Scottish sailor commanding a rotting French merchant ship sailed into British home waters and picked a fight with the Royal Navy. His ship was sinking before the battle was half over. His own ally was shooting at him. His heaviest cannons had exploded on the first broadside. When the British captain called across the smoke and asked if he had surrendered, he said no. And then he won. His name was John Paul Jones. He was a murderer running from a killing, a fugitive who had invented his own name, a man the Royal Navy called a pirate and the French called a hero. And on one moonlit night off the coast of Yorkshire, he did something no American naval officer has ever matched. He took the war to Britain's front door, knocked on it with cannons, and refused to leave until the Royal Navy answered. This is the story of the most audacious naval officer in American history, and the battle that should not have happened, that changed everything anyway. This story is not about a sea battle. It is about what audacity looks like when everything is going wrong simultaneously. Most stories of courage describe a man facing impossible odds and winning because he found something within himself that turned the tide. The Bonhomme story is not that story. The tide did not turn. The cannons exploded. The ship kept sinking. The ally kept firing into the wrong hull. Every piece of the tactical situation continued to get worse, right up until the moment it suddenly, inexplicably, stopped being worse. What Jones had was not a plan that worked. What he had was a refusal to accept that not working was the same as finished. And the question this story keeps returning to is not whether that refusal was brave. It was. The question is what it cost him. What audacity extracted from the man who carried it, through a trial for murder, through years of bureaucratic humiliation in the Continental Navy, through a battle in which his own flagship sank beneath him, and whether the country that benefited from that audacity ever gave him anything close to what it owed. Subscribe right now if you are not already here, because this is the John Paul Jones story that goes past the famous quote, past the Flamborough Head battle, past the legend and into the man, where it is more complicated and more interesting than the history books tend to go. John Paul Jones was not born with that name. He came into the world in 1747 as John Paul, just John Paul, the son of a gardener on a wealthy estate in Kirkbean, Scotland, on the shores of the Solway Firth. His father tended the grounds of Arbigland Estate. The family lived in a small cottage on property that belonged to someone else. Young John grew up watching merchant ships and Royal Navy frigates sail past on their way to and from the Irish Sea. He was obsessed with the ocean from the beginning. By 13, he had talked his way into an apprenticeship aboard a merchant vessel out of Whitehaven, the same busy port town that would later feel the weight of his return. He crossed the Atlantic as a teenager. He learned the trade routes. He learned to navigate by the stars. He learned the thing that would define his entire life, that he was very good at commanding a ship, and that he wanted nothing else. He had a private wound that he carried from the beginning. He was not a gentleman, not by the standards of the 18th century world he was trying to navigate. He was a gardener's son in a world organized around birth and breeding, moving through spaces where the men above him had rank and connection and social standing that he could never acquire no matter how good he was. He was better at sea than any of them. It did not matter. The Continental Navy would rank him 18th on the seniority list. The Russian admirals would steal his victories. The American Congress would give away the ship they promised him. Every institution he served would eventually demonstrate that merit, for a man of his origins, was never quite enough. That frustration, the specific frustration of being the most capable man in the room and being treated as something less, is the engine of his entire story. It drove him across the Atlantic twice. It drove him into battle when surrender was the rational choice. It drove him to his death in a Paris apartment at 45, still writing letters to people who no longer answered. He was not a simple hero. He was something more complicated and more human. a man who wanted recognition desperately, and whose pursuit of it was both his greatest strength and the thing that made him impossible to work alongside. In 1770, while docked in Tobago, John Paul flogged a ship's carpenter so severely the man died. An investigation cleared him, but the incident attached to his name. 3 years later, in 1773, came something worse. During a dispute over wages, accounts vary on the specifics, John Paul killed a mutinous crew member with a sword. This time, instead of waiting for a verdict, he fled the island, crossed into the American colonies, and disappeared. When he resurfaced in Virginia, he had added a new surname. He was now John Paul Jones. Nobody is entirely sure where the Jones came from. Some historians believe he borrowed it from a family in North Carolina who sheltered him. Others think he picked it because it was common enough to vanish behind. What is certain is that the man who arrived in Virginia in 1773 was running from a killing, building a new identity, and looking for a second chance in a continent that was beginning to look like it might need exactly what he had to offer. He found his second chance in the Revolution. The Continental Navy that Jones joined in December 1775 was barely a navy at all. Congress had authorized the conversion of a few merchant ships and the purchase of a handful of others. The officers commanding them were chosen mostly through political connections. Jones, a foreigner with no family ties to any congressman, was ranked 18th on the seniority list. He had more sea experience than nearly every man above him, and he knew it. He spent months writing letters to anyone in Congress who would listen. Blunt, borderline rude, exactly the kind of correspondence that makes powerful people decide to keep you ranked 18th. Jones never could understand that being right and being diplomatic were two different skills. But when he got a ship, he made the argument in the only language that mattered. Given command of the sloop Providence in 1776, he captured 16 British vessels in 6 weeks, evaded a pursuing Royal Navy frigate by sailing into shallow water where the larger ship could not follow, and returned to port having done more damage to British commerce than any other American captain that year. Congress noticed, and Jones, unsatisfied with commerce raiding in American waters, had a larger idea forming. The Royal Navy had not faced a hostile raid on British soil since the Dutch sailed up the Medway in 1667, more than a century earlier. The idea that a single American ship could cross 3,000 miles of ocean and threaten the English coast was, by every rational assessment, absurd. The Royal Navy would hunt him down before he reached land. Jones did not care. He was given the Ranger, a fast 18-gun sloop, and in November 1777, he sailed her across the Atlantic to France. The crossing was miserable, unruly crew, resentful officers, insufficient provisions, and Jones drove them across anyway. His contact in Paris was Benjamin Franklin, the American ambassador, who took an immediate liking to the scrappy Scotsman with the outsized ambition. Franklin saw in Jones exactly what the Revolution needed at that moment: someone who would actually go. In April 1778, Jones sailed from Brest into the Irish Sea and aimed for the coast of England. His target was Whitehaven, the same port where he had gone to sea as a boy, whose harbor layout he knew from memory. On the night of April 22nd, he led 2 boats of armed sailors ashore in the darkness. An American warship had just landed an armed raiding party on English soil. The last time anything like this had happened was 1667. Jones and his men spiked the cannons of the harbor fort, driving iron spikes into the touch holes to prevent them from firing, then set fire to ships in the harbor. The raid itself caused limited physical damage. Only one ship burned significantly before the locals woke up and organized a response. But the psychological impact was something the British were not prepared for. Newspapers across England ran stories about the American pirate who had attacked Whitehaven. Coastal towns from Scotland to Wales suddenly feared they might be next. The Royal Navy scrambled ships to protect harbors that had never needed protecting. Merchants in port cities that had never thought about war now thought about nothing else. One man with one ship had made the entire British coast feel vulnerable. Stop here for a moment. The war in 1778 is a conflict happening 3,000 miles away as far as most British civilians are concerned. They read about it in newspapers. They hear about colonial defeats and colonial victories as abstractions. The king is dealing with it. The Navy is dealing with it. And then armed sailors from that abstraction walk ashore at Whitehaven in the middle of the night. Subscribe if you are not already here, because what Jones does next, the kidnapping attempt, the ship-to-ship duel in Belfast Lough, and the operation that Franklin is quietly assembling in Paris, is the part of this story that most accounts rush past to get to Flamborough Head. The battle was where it ended. The audacity was everywhere before it. The same day as the Whitehaven raid, Jones crossed the Solway Firth to St. Mary's Isle in Scotland, home of the Earl of Selkirk. His plan was to kidnap the Earl and use him as a bargaining chip to force Britain to treat American prisoners of war with basic human decency instead of leaving them to rot on prison ships. The Earl was not home. Jones's crew, frustrated at the missed objective, wanted to loot the estate. Jones eventually permitted them to take the family silver, then later bought the silver back with his own money and returned it to Lady Selkirk with a polite letter of apology. This detail is worth sitting with. The man the British were calling a pirate had just returned stolen property with an apology note. The letter itself is extraordinary. Jones explained his original purpose, expressed regret that his crew's behavior had caused distress, and requested that Lady Selkirk regard him not as a brigand, but as an officer of a country, fighting for principles that he believed in. He signed it with his name and rank. It is not the letter of a pirate. It is the letter of a man who desperately wanted to be seen as something more, who understood the gap between how he was perceived and how he saw himself, and who kept trying to close that gap with gestures that were simultaneously chivalrous and slightly absurd. The next day, Jones fought and captured HMS Drake, a 20-gun Royal Navy sloop, in Belfast Lough. He sailed her back to France as a prize. He arrived in Brest as a celebrity. The French loved him, the British put a price on his head. And Jones, having proven that the British coastline could be touched, wanted something larger. Benjamin Franklin arranged it. In early 1779, the French government, now officially at war with Britain, provided Jones with an aging East India Company merchant ship called the Duc de Duras. She was large but slow, with 42 guns spread across multiple decks. Jones renamed her the Bonhomme Richard, after the persona in Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. It was a tribute to the man who had made the operation possible. It was also the name that would go down with her. The Bonhomme Richard was not a great warship. Her timbers were rotting in places. Several of her heaviest guns, a set of old 18-pounders on the lower deck, were structurally questionable. Jones knew this. He drilled his crew relentlessly anyway. The crew itself was one of the strangest collections of sailors ever assembled aboard a single ship. Americans, Frenchmen, Irishmen, Portuguese, Norwegians, Malaysians, and men from a dozen other nations, many of them former British prisoners who had volunteered for service to escape captivity. Jones's squadron was no better unified than his crew. The frigate Alliance was commanded by Pierre Landais, a French captain who was arrogant, almost certainly mentally unstable, and openly contemptuous of Jones. The other captains ignored Jones's signals from the first day at sea and sailed wherever they pleased, treating the squadron more like a loose confederation of independent ships than a coordinated fighting force. Jones was furious. He pressed on. In August 1779, the squadron set sail on a cruise around the British Isles. They sailed up the west coast of Ireland, around the wild northern tip of Scotland, through violent autumn storms, and south into the North Sea. They captured merchant ships, disrupted trade routes, attempted a raid on Leith that a sudden gale prevented. The Admiralty in London was growing desperate. Jones was everywhere and nowhere. Then, on September 23rd, off the chalk cliffs of Flamborough Head in Yorkshire, Jones spotted the convoy. Richard Pearson was 44 years old, exactly Jones's age, a career Royal Navy officer who had served competently for decades and who commanded the HMS Serapis with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his ship is better than what is coming for him. And the Serapis was better. She was brand new, copper-bottomed, armed with 18-pound cannons on her lower deck and 9-pounders above, crewed by 300 trained Royal Navy sailors who had drilled together for months. Every measurable factor favored Pearson. His private disposition was not recklessness but responsibility. He was escorting a convoy of 40 merchant ships loaded with naval stores desperately needed by the British war effort. His job was to protect those ships. He was willing to fight Jones to do it, but his motivation was the convoy, not glory. When his lookouts spotted Jones's squadron earlier that day, Pearson had signaled the merchant ships to run for shore while he moved to intercept. It was the correct tactical decision. Engage the threat, buy time for the convoy to escape, trust that his superior ship would handle whatever Jones brought at him. He was right about the ship. He was wrong about Jones. The battle began around 7 in the evening, with the sun setting over Yorkshire and a nearly full moon rising in the east. The two ships closed on each other and opened fire. Almost immediately, the Bonhomme Richard was in catastrophic trouble. Two of the old 18-pound cannons on her lower gun deck exploded on the first broadside, killing their crews and blowing holes through the hull from the inside. Jones lost his heaviest weapons before the battle had properly begun. He ordered the lower deck abandoned entirely. The Serapis pounded the Bonhomme Richard with broadside after broadside. Cannonballs tore through her hull below the waterline. Water rushed in. Fires broke out across the deck. The American ship was being methodically destroyed, and Pearson knew it. Somewhere in the smoke and the carnage, Pearson called across to Jones and asked if he had struck his colors. Had he surrendered? Jones's answer has been cleaned up by history. The specific words are debated. What is not debated is the intent. He had not yet begun to fight. What Jones did next was either genius or madness, probably both. He ordered the Bonhomme Richards to close with the Serapis until the two ships were physically touching. In the chaos of wind and current, the bowsprit of the Serapis became tangled in the rigging of the Bonhomme Richard. Jones personally helped lash the two ships together with grappling hooks and ropes. He had turned a naval battle into a bar fight. At long range, the Serapis had every advantage. But lashed together at zero distance, the battle became something the Serapis's superior guns and superior crew could not compensate for. Cannons fired directly into the opposing hull from a few feet away. Marines in the rigging shot down onto enemy decks. Sailors threw grenades across the gap. The decks were slick with blood. Then an American sailor crawling along a yardarm of the Bonhomme Richard dropped a grenade through an open hatch on the Serapis. It landed among gunpowder cartridges stacked near the cannons on the lower deck. The explosion ripped through the Serapis's gun deck, killing or maiming dozens of men in an instant. Meanwhile, the Bonhomme Richard was still sinking. The ship's carpenter ran to Jones and reported the ship was going down. An American officer, apparently deciding the battle was lost, tried to haul down the American flag in surrender. Jones reportedly knocked him down with a pistol and had the flag rehoisted. And then the Alliance opened fire. Pierre Landais, the unstable French captain who was supposed to be supporting Jones, fired multiple broadsides into the battle. Several of them hit the Bonhomme Richard. Jones was being shot by his own ally while his ship was sinking, while he was fighting the Royal Navy with cannons that had exploded on him at the start of the engagement. He kept fighting. and it was Pearson who broke. The grenade explosion had devastated his lower deck. His main mast was damaged. American sharpshooters had cleared his upper decks of men, and the Bonhomme Richard, which by any rational assessment should have struck her colors an hour ago, was still fighting. After more than 3 hours of combat, Pearson personally hauled down the British flag. He surrendered the Serapis to a man whose ship was at that moment actively sinking beneath him. Jones moved his surviving crew onto the captured Serapis. They tried to save the Bonhomme Richard through the night. On the morning of September 25th, 2 days after the battle, she slipped beneath the North Sea. Jones watched her go from the deck of the Serapis, now flying the American flag. The Battle of Flamborough Head was, by honest material accounting, a catastrophe. Jones lost his flagship. His crew suffered devastating casualties. Accounts vary, but somewhere between a third and half of his men were dead or wounded. His Allied frigate had actively worked against him. He had won a single warship. In every other way that mattered, it was transformational. Jones had fought a naval engagement in British home waters, within sight of the English coast, with hundreds of civilian spectators watching the fires from the cliffs of Yorkshire. He had defeated a brand new Royal Navy frigate with a rotting converted merchant ship, and he had done it by refusing to stop when stopping was the only rational choice. For Britain, it was a specific kind of humiliation, not the scale of a Saratoga or the strategic weight of the French alliance, but the visceral indignity of the Royal Navy being beaten in its own backyard by a ship that should have surrendered 2 hours before it did. Captain Pearson was knighted by King George III for his bravery. Jones, hearing this, reportedly remarked that if he ever met Pearson again, he would make him a lord. For America and France, Jones became the legend that the Revolution needed at that specific moment. Benjamin Franklin called him the most daring man in the American cause. The French king gave him a gold sword and a knighthood. Songs were written, portraits were painted, women across Paris were reportedly obsessed with him. Congress awarded him the only gold medal given to a Continental Navy officer during the entire Revolution. Then they gave away the ship they had promised him. The pattern that defined Jones's life continued to define it after Flamborough Head. The Continental Navy was disbanded after the war. America decided it did not need a navy in peacetime. Jones found himself without a command, without a purpose, increasingly restless and frustrated. He spent years writing letters and lobbying for the establishment of a permanent American naval force. Nobody listened yet. In 1788, he accepted a commission from Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, sailing to the Black Sea to command a fleet against the Ottoman Turks. Russian naval politics were vicious. A rival admiral, named Nassau-Siegen, took credit for victories Jones had won. Russian courtiers spread false rumors about him. He was recalled under a cloud of accusations that were never proven and left Russia bitter and stripped of the credit he had earned. He returned to Paris. The city that had celebrated him 10 years earlier was now tearing itself apart in revolution. Nobody had time for an aging American naval hero. He died in his apartment on July 18, 1792. He was 45 years old. He was buried in a small Protestant cemetery that was eventually built over and forgotten. For more than a century, nobody knew exactly where he lay. It was not until 1905 that American Ambassador Horace Porter located the coffin beneath a laundry and a grocery store in a city that had moved on entirely from the man who had helped save the American cause. President Theodore Roosevelt sent warships to escort the coffin home. Jones was given the hero's procession he had spent his life trying to earn. 113 years after he died. The question this story keeps raising is not whether Jones was brave. He was, spectacularly so. The question is what his courage cost him, and whether the country that benefited from it gave him anything close to what it owed. Jones spent his life fighting for recognition that institutions kept just out of reach. The Continental Navy ranked him 18th. The Congress gave away his ship. The Russians stole his victories. America let him die in Paris and then forgot where he was buried. The man who established the tradition that American warships do not surrender died in a foreign city at 45, without a command, without a country that needed him, without the permanent navy he had spent a decade arguing for. Richard Pearson, the man Jones defeated, was knighted. He lived another 30 years in comfortable official recognition. Jones was not wrong when he said he had not yet begun to fight. But the fight he was describing was not just the battle against the Serapis. It was the longer, slower, more exhausting fight for recognition from a country that kept finding reasons not to give it. He won the first fight. He lost the second. Drop a comment below. The Bonhomme Richard was sinking. Jones's own ally was firing into his ship. His heaviest cannons had already exploded. At what point would you have surrendered? And do you think the institution, the Continental Navy, the Congress, the American government, owed Jones more than it gave him? If this story stayed with you, the audacity and the cost of it, share it, not for the channel, because Jones spent his life trying to make people understand what he had done for them. The least the story deserves is to be told to people who did not already know it. Subscribe if you are not already here, because next time we are covering another man who gave an institution everything he had, and what the institution gave him back. The water is just where this one happened.